Good evening. I'm Nigel Redden, the General Director of Spoleto Festival USA. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first discussion in the Exploring Omar series that Spoleto Festival USA is presenting in preparation for the world premiere of Omar, the opera commissioned by the festival from Rhiannon Giddens and Michael Abels, that is to premiere on May 28th at the beginning of the 2021 festival. Omar is the latest in a series of projects commissioned and produced by the festival, inspired by Charleston, the festival's home. Charleston, now celebrating its 350th anniversary, is the perfect city for a festival, strikingly beautiful, with a surprisingly diverse group of theaters and other performance spaces that are an easy walk one from another. It's also a city that has played an outsized role in American history. As many as half of the Africans enslaved in the colonies in the United States came through the port of Charleston. Omar Ibn Said, whose autobiography the opera is based on, was one of those Africans brought to Charleston just before the official end of the slave trade in 1808. Over the last 4 years that we've been planning this opera, many of us have come to see Omar Ibn Said as someone we know and respect, whose resilience in the face of an appalling fate is inspirational. We expect the opera itself to be inspirational. Let me end by thanking some of our donors: the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Toulmin Foundation, the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art, Opera America, and many private individuals. The South Carolina Humanities Commission has generously supported these discussions organized by Nicole Taney and Letitia Smith on the festival's staff. And let me also thank you, our public. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the Director of Education and Engagement for the soon-to-be-completed International African American Museum in Charleston, Brenda Tynda, who will moderate the panel and introduce the panelists. Brenda?
Thank you so much for your thoughtful introduction, Nigel, and thank you to Spoleto for creating this important series exploring Omar. On behalf of the International African American Museum, I am so delighted to serve as moderator of this discussion as we really continue to examine the life of Omar Ibn Said and the experiences of African Muslims enslaved in the Americas. To place this subject matter into deeper context, we are really fortunate to be joined virtually by an esteemed panel of scholars. In the essence of time, their extended bios are available in the YouTube thread. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sylviane Diouf, visiting scholar at the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown University, and author of Servants of Allah, African Muslims Enslaved in the Americas. Also joining us is Dr. Ala Alryyes, Associate Professor of English at Queens College, the City University of New York, and author of A Muslim American Slave, The Life of Omar Ibn Said. Dr. Diouf, Dr. Alryyes, again, welcome. By way of introduction, is there anything you'd like to add before we jump into what will be no surprise to be a very robust conversation?
Very happy to be here and to be introducing some of the scholarship that we have about Muslims enslaved in the Americas, and of course, Omar Ibn Said.
Likewise, and thank you so much, Brenda.
My pleasure. You know, we're really tasked with understanding Omar the man, if you will. And in many ways, I think it's important to ground him in the African diaspora, in the context of African Muslims in West Africa, for instance, prior to enslavement in the Americas. And so I'd like to begin with really placing the social world of African Muslims into greater context. Dr. Diouf, obviously your book, Servants of Allah, is foundational in this regard. And I once heard you say that the birthplace of Omar Ibn Said, you described it as the cradle of Islam. Can you talk a bit about and provide a bit of historical context on the influence of Islam and African Muslims in West Africa?
First of all, I think, we need to know that Islam started to be known in West Africa in the 8th century, but it really started to spread through local local scholars and clerics at the very beginning of the 11th century. And the Muslims in West Africa were really, part of the local milieu, but they were also part of the larger Islamic world, which at some point extended from Spain to China. And they had contact on many levels with North Africa, with the Middle East. They went to Mecca. They studied in Egypt, in Mauritania. They brought back books. They also wrote their own books. So there was a constant exchange. So they were really part of this larger Islamic world. And there were among them many people who were well-traveled, well-educated, and multilingual, very dynamic people. And so I think it's important to understand, the profound impact of Islam in, for example, Senegal, Mali, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, Benin, and Nigeria, which are actually the countries from which many of the Muslims who were deported to the Americas came from.
That's very interesting. I'm wondering also, sometimes people understand Islam through a very monolithic lens, and your book speaks to sort of the diversity of the Islamic world, if you will, in West Africa and across the African diaspora. Can you speak to the diversity of ethnic groups that were engaged in African life, West African life prior to the trade?
Well, there was a diversity of ethnic groups, ethnic populations were Muslims. So you have the Fulani, you have the Wolof, you have Mandinka, etc. So it's a wide variety. Let's not forget that, again, Islam in West Africa went from Senegal in the west to Lake Chad in the east in the matter of a few decades. And so it was really adopted by very different, populations, whatever the ethnic group was.
Thank you so much. Dr. Alryyes, do you want to add anything there with regards to the world, if you will, that individuals like Omar Ibn Said really occupied within the context of the African diaspora?
What is remarkable about Omar is that, his story forces us to think about alternative interpretations of the story of slavery. And I know we will be talking about that a little bit later. But I just want to offer, one date in history that is a remarkable one, and that's, the year 1492, right? The year 1492, we often think of in America as, the year in which Columbus, and, yesterday was Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day, so it's pretty auspicious maybe that we're talking about it the day after. But it is a day that is marked by a certain kind of amnesia, because what we usually think of is a certain kind of launching west of Europeans towards the so-called New World at that time, and we forget that, and that sort of launching west also coincided with the fall of the last Muslim a principality in what then became Spain later, what were Castile and Aragon at that time, Granada. And we usually think that the kicking out, the expulsion of Muslims and Jews from Europe meant their exclusion from the New World. In other words, we usually link those two into a sort of an idea in which the movement west that begins what later would become America, of course, somehow excluded Africans, when in fact this movement came from the country, today Spain, in which there was a tremendous number, a huge number of people who were originally African, often called Moors or given other names, that were still incredibly important in the early years of the foundation of this country. So that date always interests me, 1492, for its high, one might say high voltage. I mean, 1498 is such an important year. We usually think of it as that, I remember 1992, there were these commemorations of the 500 years anniversary of the colonization of America. But we often forget that it also marked sort of the amnesia about Africans who were already in Spain, Africans and Arabs, Muslims who were in Spain at that time.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you so much for that context. So often when within American discourse, when we talk about the institution of slavery, we talk about it really thinking about the transatlantic slave trade, the importation of African peoples across the Atlantic into the Americas. But we also know that the institution of slavery and certainly the context of slavery took on different contours within the continent itself, within West Africa itself. Can we just briefly, Dr. Diouf, can you talk a bit about the concept of slavery in Islamic law? Because the definition of slavery certainly changes when you think about slavery in the context of plantation slavery, for instance, or in the New World. Can you just talk a bit about sort of slavery in that context?
Well, first of all, Islamic law is clear about the fact that a free Muslim cannot be enslaved. So that, you cannot be enslaved for any reason. So, for example, in certain society, you could be enslaved because you had killed someone, or you had, you were a thief. There were different ways of becoming a slave. In Islamic law, that was not possible. Then, what is also different is that there was no specific color or origin attached to the fact that people, could be enslaved. So there was, Europeans who were enslaved. There were Africans. There were Asians, etc. So the racial, if you will, the racial side was not present. Now, if we look at enslavement in Africa, and we're not talking there specifically about slavery among Muslims or others, but the type of slavery was also very different from what happened in the Americas, in the sense that people who were enslaved were generally used as guards, as soldiers, domestics, and a lot of people who worked the land, and they usually worked part of the time for themselves and part of the time for their owners. And people who were born in the family could not be sold. So there were a lot of profound differences between slavery in Islam and also slavery in traditional Africa, if you will, and the model that we know as the American model.
Dr. Diouf, just so that I'm summarizing what you just said, which I think is really thoughtful. I heard you say that race didn't necessarily define the institution of slavery within either a West African context as well as within a Muslim context, in the same ways that it informed the slaveocracy, if you will, in the New World. I also heard you say that labor in particular was conceptualized or was understood differently under the auspices of Muslim and West African slave traditions. Would that be a correct assumption?
Yes.
Excellent.
Could I offer two historical notes here on? Sorry, Brenda, I didn't mean to. I just wanted to.
No, please. I was actually pointing your direction.
Just to extend what Sylviane was saying, I just want to offer two historical notes. One is, if we think of the Ottoman Empire, which was the sort of grand Islamic empire at the time, in the late 15th, 16th century, that time of Columbus and the time of the beginning of the hegemony of the West in America, the Ottoman Empire, of course, was like other other political entities, acquired slaves and had slavery in it. However, it's the upper echelons of its army, its generals, were actually slaves. In other words, the Ottomans recruited their soldiers through purchase from other parts of the world. And they certainly didn't treat them like sort of chattel. They didn't treat them, they didn't whip, I mean, they were treated, and obviously they were essential to the survival of the sultans, who, for whatever internal reason, really could not trust their local people. So they actually went far afield and bought slaves. And, Suleiman the Magnificent's mother, the greatest Ottoman sultan of all, his mother was a slave as well, although she was, a white slave. But again, that's a footnote to what Sylviane was saying, which is that the color line did not really define slavery in Islam. The other thing I want to mention, which is really curious and interesting footnote to American history, U.S. history, that we don't know much about, is that in the late 18th century, so for example, I would offer this kind of interesting literary remark. In 1797, a novel called The Algerine Captive was written by a man called Royal Tyler, and it dramatizes the experience of the surgeon in the Navy who gets captured in North Africa and sold into slavery. He becomes a slave in what is today Algeria, so it's called the Algerine Captive, as an Algerine captive. And that is completely based completely on actual historical fact, which is that a large number of Europeans and Americans, who were, of course, they were at one point British subjects and then became independent. They became American, that is, politically, were actually at one point held as slaves in many of those so-called Barbary states, including Morocco and Algeria, what these states today. So we have historical evidence, actually, that within Islamic states, whether it was the Ottoman Empire or these North African Arab Islamic states, slavery was actually, when it comes to color, very colorblind.
Very, very interesting. And I think it's important to make those distinctions. Again, slavery historically is not this monolithic institution, and took on different personalities, if you will, depending on when and where it evolved. Both of you have sort of alluded to the ways in which Islam influenced the African diaspora and Africa in general. Clearly important to a discussion of Omar and understanding African Muslims is the discussion of the transatlantic trade and how that was informed by forced migration patterns that led to the importation of individuals like Omar Ibn Said. Can you provide a bit of historical context around, the historical context around when African Muslims began being imported, if you will, across the Atlantic world? So much of the history of the transatlantic slave trade is we think about some of those critical moments in the trade, the Middle Passage, for instance. But I think it's really important to put a bit of a time frame around the importation of African Muslims through the transatlantic slave trade.
So really, when the transatlantic slave trade started in the very early 1500s, first of all, we have to remember that many Muslims had been Muslims for generations. So we are talking already when the transatlantic slave trade started, that Islam had been implanted for about 500 years, right? So we also see that among the first people who were deported to the Americas were Muslims who actually came from Spain and Portugal. But then the real numbers came, you know, starting in the 1520s, and it's also important to know that within the first 50 years of the introduction of Africans to the New World, Spain passed 5 anti-Muslim bans that said that the introduction of Muslims actually needed to be stopped because they were rebellious and because there was this fear that they would convert American and they would convert Native Americans. So there was this fear of Muslims from the beginning. Nevertheless, they continued to be introduced. And there are several estimates, you know, that kind of float around concerning the number of Muslims who were victims of the transatlantic slave trade. One which is maybe the count of the latest right now is maybe around 900,000 among 12.5 million Africans who were deported. It may be a little lower, it may be higher. What we know for sure is that there were hundreds of thousands of Muslims who were victims of the transatlantic slave trade, again starting in the very early 1500s. And they arrived absolutely everywhere in the Americas, not only the United States, but throughout the Caribbean, and also places that that maybe we don't think about when we are thinking about the transatlantic slave trade, but Peru, Chile, Argentina, and of course, you know, places also like Belize, Mexico. So in my book, Servants of Allah, I followed their trace in about more than 20 colonies, British, French, Portuguese, Spanish speaking. And again, you know, they were really absolutely everywhere.
Very, very interesting. In terms of the numbers, do we know how many African Muslims across, you know, essentially from the 16th century to the 19th century were actually transported, if you will, or deported, if you will, to a place like Charleston? We know if we can provide a bit of history around the trade as relates to importation into a place like South Carolina, Charleston in particular, which Omar Ibn Said came to first. Can you talk a bit more about sort of the numbers of African Muslims who may have come to South Carolina through the trade?
It's very difficult to evaluate. What we know, for example, for the United States in general, what we've seen is that contrary to most of the other countries, there was a very high percentage in the United States of people from Senegal, Gambia, Mali, about 24%, which of course doesn't mean that 24% of them, I mean, you know, that they were all Muslims, but there is this idea that the percentage of Muslims might have been higher in the United States than in other places. Of course, not the number, but the percentage. But beyond that, we really cannot say much more. You know, it's very difficult, and we just don't want to, you know, to have percentages and numbers that really we cannot be sure of.
Sure. What were the push-pull factors, Dr. Alryyes and Dr. Diouf, certainly, what were the push-pull factors that really influenced the introduction, if you will, of African Muslims into the transatlantic trade? And this is sort of beyond sort of numbers. I'm really thinking about what were the social and political circumstances that generated that kind of interest in the deportation of African Muslims.
Well, what we're seeing specifically in the 1700s is, which is really the high point of the transatlantic slave trade. We're seeing in West Africa, Muslims being kind of revolting against the traditional leaders who were not protecting their population and were actually kind of pillaging them. And so there were Islamic movements, for example, in Guinea and Senegal, that established Islamic theocracies as a way to defend themselves and protect themselves from the, you know, from the non-Muslim raiders. And so those, you know, those events obviously meant, you know, there were wars, there were raids, etc. And when there were wars, you make prisoners and then you sell them. So that's really what happened. So there was, you know, at that time, Islam was seen by many as a protection, because the Muslims protected their own. But by the same token, when there was a war against them, or when they were at war against others, then they were made prisoners. And we see really the highest numbers of Muslims probably coming at that time.
Sure. I mean, just as maybe a comment, Africa was subject to history like any other continent, and slavery was just part of war, really, which made history. Unfortunately, war is really a history maker all over the world, has been all over history, and you know, it's really proof positive that any kind of a static picture of Africa is really misleading, and that when we think of slavery, we really need to think of it historically, and historically in a dynamic way. In other words, we can't think of it simply as slaves being supplied across the Atlantic, because that might take away some kind of agency from the kind of global historical forces. I mean, in other words, it's really important to see Africans not only as victims, but as agents of history, a history that included slavery. That is not obviously to mitigate the crime of slavery itself, but to see it as a kind of a historical phenomenon. I think that's really essential.
I think so as well, Dr. Alryyes. You know, it's so interesting. One of the things that I've been thinking about myself as a researcher is, you know, how do we tell those more nuanced narratives that doesn't just victimize individuals and collectives that were subject to slavery, and certainly to the transatlantic slave trade. I'm wondering, you know, when we talk about the concept of agency and African Muslims, how do we begin to reframe our purview in that regard?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, please, Brenda?
Yeah. How do we begin to reframe our purview with regards to agency and enslaved people? Because again, I do think that it is enslaved people are often situated as victims. I'm wondering how, to your point, how do we begin to think about enslaved people as having agency?
Well, I mean, for me, obviously, with a deep interest in the story of Omar's own autobiography, he stands out because he left a sort of a decided product of agency that is a piece of writing. On the other hand, there are other ways, more collective, for example, observations on cultural practices or religious practices in the Americas. And again, it's, I want to underscore what Sylviane is saying, which is that America doesn't just mean the US. The most productive colonies, or slave colonies in the Americas were actually not in the US, but were kind of more the sugar colonies to the south of us, in islands to the south of us, Jamaica, for example. But to your question, agency, what makes the story of Omar stands out is that he left a record that is itself a kind of a monument to the agency of a slave, as well as a memoir of a slave.
And I would like to add, in this agency discussion, what the Muslims themselves in the Americas were doing. What we see, for example, is in Trinidad, a Muslim organization at the time, who people pulled money together, and they were the first going on slave ships to buy Muslims were on the ships, and then those now free people would work and pay dues, fees to the association to be able to then buy the freedom of others. And what we see is that when slavery was abolished in the British colonies in 1834, there were almost no more Muslims who were enslaved there, because they have been able to do that. We see the same thing in Brazil, where Muslims were also pulling their monies together, not only freeing other Muslims, but also paying for their return to West Africa. We see agency also in the fact that, for example, in Brazil, they had secret Quranic schools. They imported Qurans, grammar books. We see in the United States, other people, who were also resisting through writing, through because Omar was one person, and we have several manuscripts, but there were many others throughout the Americas who wrote. I mean, we have still hundreds and hundreds of pages of manuscripts written by Muslims from Brazil to Panama. So that was one way of resisting. And there was also, as a way of resistance and agency, the fact that people refused to convert. And many also are converted because they were forced, but they continued to be Muslims. And continue to actually work with their community, some being outwardly Christian, going to a church, but then being also the leaders of the Muslim communities.
Thank you so much for elaborating on sort of the strategies and resistance strategies, if you will, that were employed by African Muslims to, in some ways, exercise cultural and religious agency. I want to pivot a bit to really hone in on the story of Omar Ibn Said. Now that we've provided a bit of historical context on the transatlantic milieu that he comes out of, And so I'd love to talk about his capture and his arrival into Charleston in 1807. Dr. Alryyes, can you place that, the narrative of his journey, if you will, and I use that very carefully, through the transatlantic slave trade to Charleston. Can you provide some context on his arrival to the Americas?
I mean, I think Sylviane might want to talk a little bit more about that, and I think the slides that we want to show are appropriate to that particular moment. I mean, if we're going to be talking about his arrival and the ship that he came on, we know that he obviously he was born in 1770, and he was enslaved and brought to America in 1807. So he was sort of, you know, an older man. He was 37 by then, right? And then he spent the rest of his life in the U.S. As we know, he was not freed. But if we want to talk about the actual details, maybe of that, I might just defer to Sylviane for a moment, and then I will talk about maybe if you would like me to, I can talk about the autobiography itself, Brenda.
So what
absolutely.
Okay. So what we know is that, and Omar writes about that in his autobiography, that he was taken at a moment where an army of infidels came, and that was the beginning of his journey. What we know is that in 1807, an army of non-Muslims, infidels, from the east, Carta, came and invaded Futa Toro, and which had become in 1776 a Muslim theocracy. And so this army invaded part of Futa. The Almami, the leader of Futa, was killed, and it's at that moment that Omar was taken a prisoner and sent to Saint Louis, which is this city at the mouth of the Senegal River. And there are two possibilities. We know that he arrived in the last days of the legal slave trade. But there are two possibilities for him to have arrived. There are two ships that arrived in 1807 in Charleston. There was the schooner Hannah, which arrived at the end of October, I think, and the sale of the people who were on board started in November. I think it was November 11. Then there was another ship, and maybe this one would be the one. The other ship, if you can show the image again, this one seems to have, it was announced in the newspaper. Its arrival was announced on December 23rd, 1807, and it came specifically from the Senegal River. And the Senegal River is exactly where actually Futa Toro is. So it arrived December 23rd, and the sale of the first 75 people started on January 11, 1808. And it's very possible that actually Omar was on that particular ship.
So, Dr. Alryyes and Dr. Diouf, both of you have alluded to the fact that Omar enters Charleston at Gadsden's Wharf in 1807, and critical to that historically is that it is amid the milieu, the shifting milieu of the laws around the transatlantic slave trade. Can you talk a bit about who Zaid may have arrived with? Who were the peoples, if you will, that were imported to Gadsden's Wharf alongside Said. Is there any commentary or context around that as well?
I'm not sure
I think I asked that question only because I want to think about the other individuals, his contemporaries, if you will, that may have arrived alongside him. Because in some ways, one of the things that we've been talking about is that Omar's story is as singular as it is sort of a composite story about African Muslims that were brought into the transatlantic slave trade and may have, of course, entered a place like Charleston. And so I'm just wondering, do we know more context around the people that have been on the ship with Omar Said?
That's an interesting point to raise, Brenda. I mean, the question of singularity versus being a representative of a group. And one thing that is interesting is that, of course, the early, when Omar becomes a celebrity, a lot of the articles in the newspapers, a lot of newspaper articles that survive, refers to him, one article refers to him in a North Carolina newspaper, refers to him as Prince Moro, right? So there are all of those idealizations of him that want to make him into this prince, I mean, because of his literacy particularly. And that was a way in which was a sort of an exit, shall we say, for, let's call it by its name, sort of racist people, to get around the question of someone like Omar, who was literate and who had sort of a distinctive mien, a kind of what they saw as distinctive mien and dignity, which is just to kind of confer a royal title on him, to kind of explain away his literacy or his distinction, and to imply that the rest don't really, the rest of the people who came really can fit easily into the kind of slavery chattel regime of the South. In other words, it's interesting to kind of see this dialectic as part and parcel of acknowledging the distinctiveness of Omar while trying to sort of imply that the rest are really not really human beings, right? So yes, that's an interesting point.
But I would go further, actually, because we've seen throughout the United States that those Muslims who could read and write were actually presented as being Arabs or Moors, because again, there was this idea that, okay, if Africans can read and write means that there are schools in Africa, teachers, students, paper, ink, and that doesn't work with this ideology of saying, well, we're bringing those savages to be civilized and Christianized. And so there was a need, if you will, to actually take the Muslims out of to take the literate Muslims out of the equation, turn them into Moors and Arabs who were civilized, while the rest of the Africans were fit for being enslaved.
That's so interesting. I mean, in many ways, Dr. Alryyes, you're talking about the how Omar Ibn Said sort of enters the national imagination, and in some ways the iconicity of his experiences, which is deeply informed by his writings, if you will, and the ways in which other interpreters began to were attracted to and or began to shed light on his experience. I'm wondering, in thinking about Omar's life, and I mean the autobiographical writings, his writings, if you will, what sort of distinguished his account, his telling of his story from the other experiences of enslaved people that comprise what some call the genre of American slave narratives, or the body of antebellum literature? I'm just wondering what distinguished Omar's story from others who may have been writing in that form eventually.
So essentially, I would say the most fundamental distinction is that Omar had literacy. He had his language, which was Arabic, clearly, the language of the written language that he had. And he brought it with him, and that he crucially did not owe his literacy to some fortunate circumstance or a benevolent gift from a master in the US, which is often how that kind of incipit of writing is portrayed in the obviously very well established and well studied genre of the American slave narrative, which is such a crucial narrative, but it's a narrative that comes with certain limitations, which I trace and kind of try to delineate in the long introduction to A Muslim American Slave, The Life of Omar Ibn Said. And that distinction is that these narratives, these English language slave narratives in the US, often they were constrained by a kind of an editorial machinery of sorts that was clearly written and formulated by white, mostly abolitionists, who wanted the experience of the slave to be straitjacketed into a certain kind of formula, a certain kind of schema, if you want, to fit into a particular story. Now, Omar gives us something entirely different, and it really is clear that what he is writing was influenced not by the genre of the American slave narrative, but much more by an Islamic genre called Sira, which is the life story, which explains what might seem curious about his narrative, which is that rather than elaborating about sort of the background or about his oppression or so and so, or about his exact details, daily details of life in Senegal, he actually spends a lot of time talking about his teachers and talking about the place of his birth and so on and so forth, and the details of his education. These are generic details that actually do not fit into the sort of slave narrative. So one thing I would stress is precisely that he is somebody who was able to write his slave narrative. First, the slave narrative does not fit within that kind of authenticating machinery of editors with a particular ideology, a particular desire. But number two, which I think is equally important, is that he wrote this narrative in a language, namely Arabic, that his captors could not read, and that allowed him a tremendous leeway in, as I argue in the introduction, introducing a number of double utterances, a number of sort of hidden meanings within the text that together seem not only to resist slavery, but to also put into question what his captors assume, which is, of course, the matter of his conversion to Christianity.
That's such a powerful reflection of his work. And on that matter, his work seems to signify this sort of religious syncretism, or perhaps even conversion. And for instance, his translation of the Lord's Prayer in Arabic. What does that tell us about Said's evolving faith or religious identities? And I use the term identities in plural because of the matter of literacy and language, and the concept of conversion and how that nuances his telling of the story.
I mean, I will, in regards to Omar, I would say that it allowed him, what we call religious syncretism, allowed him an access to a certain degree of spirituality. I mean, there's no doubt that he went to church with the Owens. There's no doubt that he was enjoyed enjoyed the company. He enjoyed the spirituality. However, the question of conversion, as it has often been foisted on him, seems to speak to a misreading of his experience. There's no doubt that once slaves came to the U.S., they had to somehow negotiate a world in which they lost, amongst other things, their religious freedom. But that did not mean that they did not have strategies of resistance that allowed them to maintain their faith. As Sylviane was saying, for example, secretly praying. We know that descendants of slaves in Georgia, in the Sapelo Islands, clearly had memoirs that were collected by the WPA of names of religious recitations of turning towards the east when they prayed, for example, as Muslims do when they turn towards Mecca, that were reported by their descendants without knowing exactly what their ancestors were doing, right? So yes, in that sense, they did hold to their religion for a while, but that obviously does not mean that it actually passed to their descendants as well. So yes, there was a degree of loss, but that loss was gradual, and it was not necessarily a loss brought by outright conversion.
Thank you so much. Such powerful commentary from both of you. We want to make sure we give the audience, our viewing audience, an opportunity to pose questions to the panel to answer. Are there any questions from our audience that we'd like to introduce into our conversation this evening? Okay, so our first question, Omar's autobiography, his writings at Library of Congress, and Spoleto's opera are really concrete examples of how Said is being memorialized within American culture. How will the International African American Museum treat his history? And I can take on that question quickly. We hope to ensure that Omar Ibn Said's story is part of a much larger story of the African diaspora. We do profile him in various components of our exhibition, namely in our telling of enslaved individuals that were enslaved in Charleston. And so we do talk about him in a number of galleries at the museum. But I personally think that question can serves as an important point of discussion for the panel. I mean, how is Omar Ibn Said being memorialized, both within American culture, but also across the African diaspora? And I'm posing that question to our panel.
So far, I mean, when we're talking about the African diaspora, we are talking about not Africa, but the African diaspora. And, a lot of this is not very well known, first of all. Now, in Africa, not very much as well, but I would just mention that the autobiography was sold at auction in New York in 1996, and I was at the auction. My friend, Derek Bird, bought the autobiography as well as some other Islamic manuscript from Panama. And what he did was, about a year or 2 years later, he took the autobiography to Senegal. And so even if Omar himself never went back, his autobiography was at some point in Senegal, and Derek shared it with scholars there. So there is, if you will, in Senegal, at least some knowledge about him. In the wider African diaspora, I don't think that at this point yet, it is well known. In the United States, there is, he has been claimed and reclaimed by American Muslims, and that's important. There is a mosque in Fayetteville, which is the Omar Ibn Said Mosque. So this is, things move very slowly, but they do move. And I just wanted to also add that two scholars, Professor Lowe at Duke and Professor Ernst at UNC Chapel Hill, are working on an article on Omar and a book. And their research is based, for one, on 15 documents, and for the others on 17 documents, using not only Arabic, but also Wolof and Fula. And I think that with those two contributions, we should know a lot more.
Excellent. Dr. Alryyes, any comment there on how Omar Ibn Said is being memorialized across the African diaspora, on the continent, in American culture? I mean, your translation seems of his writings seems critical to how he enters at least the American cultural imagination.
Yes, and I also would like Sylviane, I want to take this moment to praise Derek Beard, who shared that manuscript. I mean, he bought it with his own money, and then he shared it. I was in graduate school at that moment, and the manuscript, I was sort of asked to translate it. And, you know, obviously, he could have just kept it to himself. He could have done with it whatever he wanted, which is really remarkable, right? I mean, that manuscript was known. As you know, it has a very curious history. Mine is not the first translation. Obviously, my argument is that earlier translations were not adequate for all sorts of reasons, for omissions, emendations, whatever. We can talk about that, but that will take many hours because there is, as I sort of argue in the introduction, there is a story of the life itself. There's the life, Omar's life, the life of the man. There's the life with the capital L, which is the autobiography he wrote in Charleston. In Fayetteville, I'm sorry, in 1831. And then there's, of course, again, a whole apparatus, which is, I mean, you could go to the Library of Congress website and look at the beautiful manuscript, which is now digitized and available. The cover, there's a cover, sort of a title page that was added later in English. And it's kind of, obviously not written by Omar, it's written by people related to his masters. Unfortunately, I have to use that word, the Owens, and it traces the circulation of the manuscript. And so there's a whole story to the life that is about sending it from one person to another person with various intentions, which I trace in the life in the book. And they, each one has an intention. Each one has written other. There's a very interesting man called Theodore Dwight, and there's another man called Isaac Beard. They all have really interesting scholarly concerns. Some of them are very interested in Africa and have written on it. They published on it, and so that whole context was really brought to the fore, which has never been explored before. That kind of circulation of the manuscript, and that was really because Derek was willing to share that manuscript itself after it disappeared. It just disappeared and was rediscovered in a trunk in Virginia before the sale that Sylviane spoke about and attended. So for a long time, it just basically someone bought it. We know that the last owner before its sale to Derek was a member of the American Numismatic Society. That's it. And then obviously it went to some family members and it ended up in a trunk in Virginia. That's what we know.
Wow. In some ways, Dr. Alryyes, what I hear you saying is that at least Omar's life, the autobiographical writings seem to have an ebb and flow in terms of its circulation, in terms of its sort of interpretation, and in some ways, are we witnessing, or through that interpretive landscape, is there a way in which Omar's life is being sort of reconstructed in a particular way? Should we be skeptical of those reconstructions as we're reimagining Said's life?
I think we should always be skeptical as scholars and as historians and as literary analysts. But I think there is reason to also say that possibly we are more, we don't come with certain cultural assumptions that preclude thinking of Omar as equal to us, right? There is no doubt that a generation before, or that when the earlier translation, was a certain kind of condescension towards what the editor referred to as literate Mohammedans in the US. You can see from that language that kind of thing that Sylviane was referring to, the exclusion of certain Africans from being African because they were literate or because they were perceived as being Muslim, therefore they weren't black, or they weren't Africans, whatever. All of that all of these cultural biases, I think we are hopefully doing a little bit better with them. We also have, I think there is something about, our readings of the manuscript that seem to be right. So, for example, I don't know if you can, is it possible to show one of the slides? The one, yes, exactly. Thank you. If you can see this detail of the manuscript, this repeated word in Arabic, you can't miss it. It's the word that is repeated. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. Is the word no in Arabic, the word la. And this is the moment where someone, an overseer from the South, from Charleston actually, has gotten to Fayetteville, to the prison in which Omar was being released from before he was bought by the Owens. And this is the moment a question is posed to him, which is, do you want to walk back with me to Charleston, to South Carolina? And he answers no 7 times, right? No, I don't want to walk with you to South Carolina, right? Or to Charleston. And this is because this is a moment where, he, as he says in the autobiography, his owners in South Carolina were cruel to him and made him work in the fields and do sort of hard work that he wasn't qualified for. And he kind of preferred, obviously, to stay with the Owens that ended up, treating him better, as he says in the autobiography. But I think we are now aware or awake, right, to such details in the manuscript, and to sort of a micro reading of the manuscript, even, or a parsing of it, that is that focuses on trying to decipher details from his life that speak to his suffering, even if he can't or he could not really speak about it openly.
Wow. In some ways, this image is a critical moment that tells us so much about Omar's experience in South Carolina and versus his experience in North Carolina, and ultimately his escape. And in some ways, I almost feel like this is an example of agency, of being able to say no, I don't want to return. Can you speak to a bit about his escape and the ways in which that shows up in the context of the autobiography, of his writings?
I mean, the story of the escape is, I find that remarkably interesting and enigmatic, because he sort of, he says that I was put to work in the fields and that I am an old man. I can't do that kind of work. That work is hard for me. I cannot do it. I'm an old man. And then he escapes. He's clearly a scholar. He's someone who is not made to work in the fields, and yet he is put to work in the fields for a number of years before he escapes and heads. And then he says that I walked, and then he says that I stayed in a number of what he refers to as buyut, as houses. And we don't really know what he means by that word, during that escape to North Carolina. He is discovered by a sort of a chase party. A young boy chases him. There are a bunch of guys on horses, clearly looking out for runaway slaves. He's identified as a runaway slave. Luckily, he has by now made it to the north. He is in Fayetteville, and he's taken to the local jail, where right now I guess it's legendary that he, it seems, took a piece of chalk or a piece of coal actually from the floor and wrote on the walls of his prison cell in Arabic, which sort of created a bit of notoriety and attracted, it seems, high-powered people. He ends up being bought by a highly placed person, Jim Owen, whose brother was to become a future governor, actually, of North Carolina, a man by the name of John Owen. So the story of the escape is interesting. For me, one of the most interesting details is when Omar says, that I hid in houses, right? It's not clear what houses are, whether it was, for example, whether they were places, whether he was welcomed into places by sympathetic people sympathetic to escaped slaves. But it is an interesting, and of course, the fact that we don't have so many details about that speaks to, I would say, a kind of laconic quality in the narrative as well, including, of course, as I said earlier, in the middle passage, that he doesn't really expatiate on what happened to him during the middle passage and so on. But here there are clues that something interesting happened during his escape, and that he was able to, he got some help, or he was able to hide somewhere, but we don't have many details about that, unfortunately. But that, calls for further research and further historical reconstruction, actually.
Dr. Diouf, any additions you want to make there with regard to the importance of his escape to his narrative?
Well, it's interesting to see that this is kind of a pattern, because, when I say a lot, let's say that a number of Africans who had just arrived or were newly arrived also escaped. And that was very well known. That was, that was something that people expected, really. So the fact that he ran away, the fact that another Muslim, very well-known, Ayouba Souleymane Diallo from Senegal, who arrived in 1731, he also ran away. Ibrahima Abdelrahman, another Muslim from Guinea, enslaved in Mississippi, also ran away. And, and that was one of the things that newly arrived Africans did a lot. And so the fact that he did too is really kind of the a normal pattern, if you will. For him, it really kind of paid off, because instead of being sent back, to his owner, he was able to actually move on, and that was kind of the same thing for Diallo, but for others, unfortunately, they were just sent back.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Diouf. Another question from our audience is Omar's autobiography the only known autobiography written by an enslaved person while still enslaved in the United States?
Okay, I'll take up that question, and the answer needs to be qualified. I mean, if we're talking about an autobiography written by someone in a language that he brought with him, that he wasn't really, in other words, not in English, in the US, then the answer has to be yes. The issue, but if we say, is it the only piece of writing written by someone in the United States in languages other than English, then I would say no. So we have to make a distinction between an autobiography and other writings that could be amulets, they could be fragments, they could be all sorts of things. And there were many of those written in the United States. But again, to speak about a biography with its kind of flow, with its arc of beginning, middle, and end, it really does generically stand out. And there's, it really is, in many ways, a remarkable document. And the document, as I said before, of both documentation of life, a kind of an autobiography and also a document of resistance. And yes, I would say that if we keep in mind what I just said before, that is to distinguish it from slave narratives that are written in English in the U.S., then I think the answer is yes.
Oh, the concept of it as a document of resistance. I really want to dig deeper there, because in some ways, what I've heard you say throughout the conversation is that it's written in Arabic. In some ways, makes it part of this a document of resistance in many ways. But wasn't his writings, the autobiography, sort of circulated as part of an anti-slavery movement of sorts? So I guess what I'm trying to ask is both the form and the interpretation and circulation of his work informs this sort of concept of the autobiography being as you put it so brilliantly, a document of resistance.
Thanks, Fred. I mean, yes, these are two yeses. I mean, in a certain way, the document was commissioned, one might say. I mean, Omar opens his autobiography by a comment to a Sheikh Hunter, whom he says has asked him to write this narrative. And we know that that man is actually part of a group called the American Colonization Society. And they were interested, as I traced in their introduction. I don't think we probably have the time now to talk about them. I'm not sure how much time we have left, but I will say that they were interested in famously sending freed African slaves back to Africa, to Liberia, mostly, of course, in order for them to solve a problem that many people who were against slavery, right, saw. And that problem really was the problem of what do you do with a freed Black population in the United States? That is, many people in the middle Atlantic states some of them did not want slavery, but they also did not want to give freed Blacks any kind of citizen rights, right? So they found a solution, and that solution was called colonization. It meant sending them back to Africa as freed persons to live in Liberia and to have, So we know that one of the people who actually figure in the title page that I mentioned of Omar's life, a man called Lamin Kibbe. The word Yamin in Arabic means right hand, so Lamin, the rightiest probably, Kibbe, was actually freed. He was clearly someone Omar knew well. He was freed and corresponded with, was freed, in fact, and went back to Liberia. So that man, Lamin Kibbe, was actually one of those people who left the US. Omar never did. So Omar was kind of asked to write within, but it's clear Omar himself did not really want to be sent back, apparently. And his writings themselves, if you could look, for example, if we have a moment for the second slide, possibly, this is a Quranic verse, a Quranic ayah or surah, actually. The last piece of writing that Omar wrote, and it's preserved in North Carolina library. And in it, Omar sort of writes an Islamic surah, which is the victory. It's the translation of it is, if God sent you victory and you saw people entering into your faith in numbers, so thank God for his assistance, and for he is merciful, and so on. But Omar seems to be casting a kind of, as I say in the introduction, many times during the writing of the autobiography, Omar seems to be kind of casting himself in certain rhetorical roles that allow him to, it seems, to sort of offer a certain kind of idea or concept that would not be clear to his owners, right? So in this case, it would seem that he is likening himself in some sort, a rhetorical sort, to Muhammad, who himself was oppressed and had to be to escape Mecca because his tribe was oppressing him. And therefore, there are moments in the narrative that seem to kind of signal hidden rhetorical strategies of resistance, and this is one of them.
Thank you. We have another question from an audience member for Professor Diouf. Our comment is, you seem to argue that Omar's capturing coincides with the death of Abdel-Kader Khan in the southern part of Torah. I'm sorry, it's a bit blurry. Do you believe Omar was from that region as well?
He was from Futa Toro, yes. He actually mentioned it in his autobiography.
And so I think if I'm correct, I think the question is being asked. One, you're arguing that his capturing coincides with the death of Abdel-Kader Khan. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay. Just wanted to clarify that.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other questions from our audience? Thank you, Dr. Diouf, for answering that question. I have a whole host of questions. I'm particularly intrigued with the concept of resistance. Again, resistance. The document as a mode of resistance, the use of the language as a mode of resistance. And Dr. Diouf, you know, your discussion around the ways in which African Muslims in the Americas, the insurrections during the transatlantic slave trade, and sort of escaping, running away, if you will, seems to be an important part of understanding the lived experience of African Muslims in the New World. I mean, would that be a correct assumption to sort of say that there's a way in which African Muslims have been positioned within a narrative of resistance?
Absolutely.
Within the
yes. And so there was, you know, resistance by writing. And again, you know, we have hundreds of pages written by Muslims, you know, in other colonies. And what we see is those were writings for themselves, you know, for their community, contrary to, for example, Omar's piece, which was done kind of on command, if you will. They were writing for themselves, you know, for their community. And as, you know, galvanizing their communities, there were also pieces of plans for revolts and, you know, those kinds of things. Now, we also know that as Omar was arriving here, there was a series of conspiracies and revolts by Muslims in Brazil, in Bahia from 1807, culminating, you know, in the largest slave revolt in the Western world after the Haitian Revolution, and that was in 1835 in Bahia, and there were hundreds of Muslims who were involved. We also see in the Haitian Revolution in 1791, the French found papers written in Arabic in the bags of the people that they had killed. We know that Macandal in the 1750s in Saint-Domingue was a Muslim. He was a Maroon leader, and he had a large conspiracy to actually overtake the island. That was discovered. It was burned. It was burned at the stake. So there were movements by Muslims in Puerto Rico, in Panama, in Hispaniola. There was really, really a strong refusal of enslavement, and Muslims were really involved in cultural, religious, and kind of political, if you will, resistance. So it was not only writing, but it was actions as well.
Wow. You know, we are actually closing in on our time. We have roughly about 4 more minutes. The final question, really, to close us out, what does Omar's life, his autobiography, reveal about the unique experiences of African Muslims in the antebellum South? And it relates to, it builds on what you just shared, Dr. Diouf. You know, in other words, as a reader of Omar's autobiography, what do we learn? What is our takeaway in terms of understanding the African Muslim experience in the South?
Well, I think his experience was not unique at all. Again, we have several Muslims who actually wrote in the United States different types of documents. There's a 13-page document written by Bilali Mohammed in Georgia, which is part of a 10th century work by Tunisian. And so we have that, we have others. And I think that we are looking at people who, although they were enslaved, continued to be intellectually, wanting to express themselves in an intellectual way, who never forgot the things that they had learned in school, and who found that it was really part of their culture to write. Just like if we look at ourselves, even if we find ourselves in precarious conditions, etc., we are not going to just forget what we know, what we learn, and whatever the circumstances they were in, and those were absolutely horrible circumstances, they were still who they were. They were still educated people. They were still Muslims. And they continue to express themselves as such.
Wow. Well, we have to stop there. I want to thank Dr. Alryyes as well as Dr. Diouf for facilitating what I think is the beginning of a robust conversation regarding the life and narrative of Omar Ibn Said and the history and experiences of African Muslims in the New World. I can't think of a better group of scholars to kick off this important conversation. Thank you so much for contributing your time, and most of all for the body of scholarship that you have contributed to help us begin to think in more nuanced ways about Omar Ibn Said and African Muslims enslaved in the New World.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that concludes our discussion. Thank you all for being a captive audience.